Hello, this is The Quest for the White Merle by Lilian Gask, published in 1909, and this is the first chapter, Barney Speaks. It was growing dusk in the big barn as Conrad settled his last silver fritery in its new place. He had been rearranging his collection of butterflies all that afternoon, for his father was out driving with the doctor, and the long, low house behind the hill was very dreary when no one was at home. The barn had been Conrad's playroom all his life, but it was more than a year now since his bricks and his soldiers and even the big toy pistol that he could not yet think of without a pang had been handed over to the rectory kids, the smallest of whom was barely 10 months younger. "And why so, pray?" inquired the owl, deliberately stretching his wings and blinking his right eye slowly, while he kept the left one immovably fixed. Conrad shut the lid of his collecting box with a snap. "Because then," he said, "you would be of some use in the world instead of just eating and sleeping and staring at people as though they had horns. I was reading last night in that old book I found behind the cupboard how, at the first clear notes of a White Merle's song, light would come back into the eyes of the blind. And Father's growing blind as a bat. He thought I was Janet when I went into him this morning, just because I trod very quietly and didn't make a row. I don't believe that he will ever be able to paint another picture, not even to finish the one he began last year." Conrad's voice broke in what would have been a sob if he had not swallowed hard, and the owl, by way of showing his sympathy, stopped blinking his right eye and tried the left one. "There are plenty of pictures in the world already," he said consolingly. "What is one more or less? Why, what's the matter? Woo, woo, woo!" He might well have been amazed, for Conrad had actually thrown a book at him. It hit the rafter just beyond the one on which he sat. After a moment's pause, he lifted his wings and with stately dignity sailed out through the open window into the gathering gloom with a low hoot that was full of meaning. The book had fallen to the floor with a broken back, and Conrad felt rather ashamed of himself as he picked it up. The sound of wheels on the moss-grown drive, the doctor's hearty voice bidding his patient hasten in out of the cold night air, and Conrad knew that his father had come home. He waited for a few minutes before following him into the panelled hall, where a long brown trunk, dinted and bruised with much hard service, lay ready for the carrier's van. As he caught sight of it, Conrad remembered with a start that it was actually tomorrow, the very next day, that his father was going to London. He would be away for a whole month, for some great doctor there was going to see what he could do for his eyes. Conrad did not believe in doctors one bit. They're never any use, except for measles and broken legs, he thought, as he hurried into the studio and stumbled over the tiger's skin just inside the door. "Gently, old fellow," his father cried, holding out a slender hand that had grown very thin and white. "I knew it was you this time. You never remember the terror's head." "What an enormous brute he must have been," said Conrad reflectively, looking at the length of the tawny yellow striped and barred with black that stretched halfway across the room. "I suppose he was the largest tiger you ever shot." "Ah, but not the largest tiger I hoped to kill," replied his father, his dim eyes brightening as at some pleasant thought. "When I was still in my early 20s, my cousin Arthur, who was as fond of collecting as you are, Conrad, offered to take me around the world if I would help him with his specimens. One of the most interesting places we visited was the Malay archipelago, and there, on the island of Java, I saw a tiger so enormous that the terror himself would have been a dwarf by comparison. We had intended to put up at a small village in the interior, but when we reached it we found the natives in such a state of excitement that no one would have anything to say to us. After a while we learnt, through an interpreter, that one of the chief men had been dragged off a bullock cart by a huge tiger in broad daylight and carried away into the jungle. The poor fellow was related to nearly everyone in the village and had a large following. So we were not surprised when we heard that some 500 or 600 natives had sworn to have that tiger's blood. I was very anxious to see a tiger hunt and offered to join the hunters. After some demur, they agreed to take me, believing that the unusual sight of a white man would help to lure the tiger from his lair. I was presented with a short spear, the only weapon carried by any of the natives, and shown my appointed place in the great throng. The beaters, having discovered in what part of the forest the tiger lay hidden, we formed ourselves round it in a wide ring, closing in gradually until the tiger, enraged at the natives' shouts and shrieks, rushed out with angry snarls. He was met with a shining circle of glittering spears, and when, baffled and perplexed, in a last wild gust of fury he made a spring, mine happened to be one of the spears on which he fell. His death was only a matter of moments then, and his splendid skin was stabbed to pieces. That sharp yellow tooth I gave you for the museum was once in his head. "Wasn't it on that same island that you saw so many peacocks?" asked Conrad. "Yes, and they were the most gorgeous birds I ever beheld," his father said. "Their neck feathers were the hue of burnished emeralds, and although their crests were different from those of the peacocks we had seen in India, their tails were just as beautiful. But I think that the hummingbird would have taken your fancy most. One little creature, I remember, was like a sparkle of living flame. I shall always recollect with pleasure the weeks I spent on those fairy islands. Wherever one turned there was something strange or wonderful to look at. And the birds in particular were so very lovely that I was quite surprised to come across a big white owl that must have been a near relation to our own Barney. By the way, he almost flew in our faces just now as we drove round the barn. If the cob's nerves hadn't been fairly sound, the buggy would have been upset." Conrad flushed as he recalled the reason why Barney had made his exit in such a hurry, and was glad that the ting, ting, ting of the Chinese gong that Janet sounded for supper saved him from the necessity of making any reply. Supper was a very silent meal, for he was thinking of his father, and his father was thinking of him. And Barney's distant woo, woo, woo that floated in through the open window was scarcely cheering. It sounded as if he were still aggrieved and was telling the night wind all about it. "I'll make it up to him with him tomorrow," said Conrad to himself as he went to bed. But all through his dreams that night a sad white owl chased an emerald and sapphire peacock round and round the barn, and the peacock's discordant cries prevented him from hearing the White Merle's song. "You'll find it very lonely, I'm afraid, old fellow," his father had said, anxiously leaning out of the carriage window as Conrad stood next day on the station platform. "But you'll have the rectory boys, and the Blakes as well, and I shall be home again soon." Conrad nodded. He did not feel like speaking just then. He was fonder of his father than anyone else in the world, and he hated to think of him in the dark, with his kind eyes clouded. As the train steamed off, he caught a last glimpse of his waving hand, and his longing to do something to help him grew so strong that it was almost a pain. "This is worse than being hungry," he thought with a deep sigh as he left the station. It was somewhat consoling to remember that it was almost tea time, and with another sigh not quite so deep as the first, he turned into the rectory gate and made his way up the wide gravel path, flanked on either side by clumps of purple lilac. The rectory was a capital place to go to for tea, and Conrad thought with satisfaction of the hot buttered cakes and apricot jam he felt sure he should find on the schoolroom table. He was surprised to see no sign of life in the front of the house. Could anyone be out, he wondered? Just then he became aware that the rector was hurrying towards him, a very deep wrinkle on his high white brow, and his thin grey hair much ruffled. "Oh, you mustn't come in, my boy," he said in a distressed voice. "They've caught the mumps, every one of them, and we're in quarantine. I believe the Blakes have them too." Conrad explained that he wasn't afraid of mumps, but the rector would have nothing to say to him. Nor would Mrs. Blake when he called at her house on his way through the village. Mrs. Blake looked very hot and very troubled. She said that the governess and the housemaid had given notice already, and she did not know what she was going to do. Conrad went home very soberly and ate up the remainder of a pot of marmalade without thinking what he was doing. "You'll nae get mair the week," old Janet cried indignantly, and, being very deaf, was quite unmoved by his remonstrances. A little later, and he was back in the barn, waiting patiently for Barney to wake up. Then, at the first movement in the oak rafter, he made a handsome apology for his behaviour the night before, which Barney was graciously pleased to accept. "I should not have minded for myself," he said, "but the owls belong to an old and important family, and must not be insulted. There are relations of ours in almost every part of the globe. Our wisdom is never questioned, and as wise as an owl has become a proverb." Conrad's thoughts went back to the White Merle, that mysterious bird whose song could cure his father. If the owl were as wise as he said, why couldn't he help him to find her? Barney thoughtfully scratched his head when this was suggested to him, the amber fire of his eyes glowing brighter than ever. "I suppose you know," he said at last, "that a merle is really only another name for a blackbird. All merles, I have heard, were white at one time, and if the magpie who told me is to be believed, they have only themselves to thank for their sooty feathers. One lovely day in spring," she said, "a merle discovered a magpie gloating over a pile of gold and silver and glittering gems in a hollow tree. Not content with the green of the leaves and the blue of the sky and the gold of the sunlight as it danced on the bubbling brook, the heart of the merle was filled with envy. And with many threats he commanded the magpie to tell him where she had found such treasures. The magpie directed him to a deep subterranean passage, at the end of which she declared he would find their owner, the Prince of Riches. "You will pass through 3 caverns first," she added impressively, "full of glittering gems and precious metals, but on peril of your life you must not touch them until you find the Prince of Riches and gain his permission." The merle lost no time in seeking the secret passage under the rocks, and as he soon found the 3 great caverns that the magpie had described. In the first of these was a heap of shining silver. He flew straight past it, for it was only the colour of moonlight, and that was not grand enough for him. In the second cavern it was hard to control his longings, for the ground was strewn with jewels of dazzling brilliance, rubies as red as the sky at sunset, and emeralds like the deep waters of some magic lake. The walls of the third were encrusted with diamonds, while grain upon grain of glistening gold was piled in the very centre until it reached the vaulted roof. This was too much for the greedy merle. He forgot the magpie's warning, and plunged his beak into the gleaming heap. As he did so, there was a sound as if the very earth were torn asunder. The cavern was filled with fire and smoke that almost choked him, and the terror-stricken bird flew back to the open air. He left the treasure behind him, but his pure white plumage was besmirched for ever, and his beak remains the colour of gold to this very day. "Then there isn't a well anywhere now?" cried Conrad despairingly. Barney toot-toot several times before he answered. They say that whenever the soul flies free of a woman who has never sinned through greed or selfishness, a merle is born whose plumage is once more as white, as pure as snow. This may be so, but I have never seen one. Perhaps she sings in lands that are far away. I shall go and find her, cried Conrad. I wish you luck, said the big owl calmly, and quietly spread his wings.